Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you to the embassy and to the MCC, and thank you for helping sort this rather difficult technological problem out. So I'm going to be going backwards and forwards, so I'm going to come in and out of sound over the course of the next 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, so this is the beginning of what I hope will be a small research project on the literature that took the Mongolian literature between the Great Repression, the end of the Great Repression in 1939, and the death of Tribelson and Stalin in the early 50s. And what this is really about is the beginning, one aspect of the beginning of this period, and a particular book which appears to be of considerable importance in defining and developing what became the literature after this of this period. So, okay, just to recap on the numerous deaths and the deaths of some of the leading writers of the 1930s. These people were not represented for many different reasons after their death in the 1930s. Natsak Dorje and Seod seem to have died of natural causes, although Natsak Dorje may have been hounded to his death by the government. Buyanemek and Yadimasuren were executed very, very soon after the beginning of the Great Repression in September, October 1937. Ayush, who was the leading dramatist, was executed as being a Japanese spy in 1938. Sanjit, the army poet, who didn't write very much, but who wrote enough to be relatively well known at the time. He was also executed, as was Sodnom Dorje, who wrote a number of really significant stories, such as Udyankhai Balshinyam, about the 1932 uprising in the west of the country among the monks. And as an aside, I just discovered the other day that Sodnom Dorje, when he was in prison, is supposed to have cut himself and written on the wall of his cell "Death to Tribelson and Luvsan Sharif," which probably didn't help his cause at all. But he and all of these were by this time dead, and so what we're going to be talking about today is what happened after the Great Repression, after these people were executed. And of course, don't forget, they weren't just executed, or they didn't just die. They were kind of obliterated for a while until the early 60s, at least officially. Okay, so in 1941. The State Publishing House published this this very short book, 87 pages, which we could translate the title something like "Oh Young Gorkys, Create or Make Something," or I don't know. It's difficult to translate it really in a way that we would have in English, but something like that. Young Gorkys, create. Please create. Okay. And just inside the cover, we have the. Actually, of course, this is black and white, but in the printing is red, red and black. Young people take part in artistic competitions, something like that. So already, the discourse is that young people, young Gorkys, of course. Bringing in the idea of Maxim Gorky, who'd already died in 1936, and was the father, as it were, of socialist realism, right back until the publication in 1906 of his book, his novel, The Mother, Mati. So already we have this idea not of the old guard, the dead, the censored material of people like Boyanemek and Natsagdod Adam Soren, but now we have the really young, adventurous, modern, revolutionary poets. Okay, so the NPRP 10th Congress in March and April of 1940 had a number of key ideas, as I'm sure some of you are aware. One was the continued and intensifying friendship with the Soviet Union, which escalated also during the escalation of World War II, which the Soviet Union joined on 21st of June 1941. The development of livestock breeding on a collective level as a fundamental basis of the national economy, and Stalin and Joybelson had met in December 1939 before the Congress and discussed intensely about the development of livestock breeding. And it is from there that Stalin's idea of raising 200 million livestock came. Intensive development of industry, higher productivity at lowest cost, greater political awareness among the workers, and greater technical skills and discipline. This is all mirroring, of course, a lot of what was happening in the Soviet Union at that time, and also primary education for children. All children were supposed to be, by the end of this period, educated at least on a grade school level, primary school level. So my original idea was to color code these in relation to the poems that I'll show you in a moment. I don't know whether it worked, but just see if you can remember the colors as we go through. Okay. But there is also an important text, which was a statement by the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Revolutionary Youth Union, called Maxo. I know nothing about Maxo apart from his name. So if anybody knows anything, please let me know. This is I think this will be important in developing the research on this particular book. And this was concerning the development of the revolutionary literature. This was 25th of July, 1940. And there are 2 points that I wanted to bring up in order to expand, and these are my translations of sections of this. In order to expand and develop literature in this country, we will publish the best work from among young and talented literary writers. And in order to increase literary activity, we will take care to educate new writers and develop their talent through criticism and by helping them to improve. And then number 5, in addition to an unbroken series of pieces published in Ardent Soil and Zam, work should be published in newspapers and especially in magazines, and from this the number of small volumes of literary works should increase greatly. Well, you can already see this is not the only book that was published in about this time. There are about 2 or 3 such books, such anthologies. So you can already see that there is a very strong feeling among the Revolutionary Youth Union, filling in, relating to what was decided in the 10th Congress. Okay. And so this, for those who remember the color coding, so there are 18 pieces in this. There's one piece of prose, which is with Ganbar the student, Ganbar Suraj. And there are maybe some names here that we recognize, like Sengai and Sendochir and Bast and Sodnom, Khamsuran and Kholo right at the bottom. So just looking at some of the, think about the statistical distribution. We have some about the party, some about social change of various different types. Labour, so the party is in red. I mean, it's not very clear. So the party is these red ones at the top. Labour and industry here in brown. The relationship between Sukhbata and Tribelson, represented by this really interesting figure, Tantric Joe, exclusively by him actually. Then there's a bunch of youth like Ganbat the student and Sendochia's pioneer camp, and then 1, 2, 3. Yeah, they're like 4 on the livestock policy, which is really kind of like the central idea here. All right, and also Udval. Udval's over the other side. She was very young at this stage, but as we know, she turned into a very powerful person who was in fact one of the people who became the announcer of the rehabilitated the rehabilitation of writers like Natsik Boyanemek and Yadamasorin and so forth in the early 60s. All right, so this is basically the outline of the book, and in future research, hopefully, I can look at most of these texts. There are some people whose dates, whose identity is very uncertain, like Dagvadoj and Ragjasurn and Batmunk. And this Sengai, who is not De Sengai but Sengai. But generally speaking, we know at least who these people are. So I really just want to look at 3 poems because we already, I'm sure, I'm almost stretching the limit. So Lamsarin's piece, one of his text is about livestock herding, and he quotes here Stalin's idea of reaching 200 million of the 5 types of livestock, which is the precious jewel of revolutionary Mongolia. I also want to draw your attention to the final section in my slightly inelegant translation. May the active members of our party and our union lead the way, and may our Mongol herders work together efficiently to put into practice the clear resolutions of our famed party's 10th Congress and raise our livestock herds without respite. So a constant desire to do what the party is asking and increase the livestock in Mongolia. All right, and of course we have the Stalin, the sharp and brilliant hero of labor. Okay. The second piece is Sengai's, who was at this time 24 years old. This is actually called, well, I've translated it as the shock worker, but it's actually got a Russian name, Udanik. So yeah, it's Udanik. So I originally translated it as Udanik, but I think the shock worker also works. Anyway, so and this is interesting because actually this did not appear in his collected works. So maybe he wanted to ignore this one after the death of Stalin and Tribelson, and before his own death in 1959. The beginning, fervor for Tribelson blazes from your heart, the strength in your muscles pulses like electricity. Led by the teaching of Stalin, you master your role, and when you enact with consummate skill Stakhanov's experience, the sweat drips from your joyful brow, and your majestic labor brings great accomplishment. Isn't it wonderful? So this is a reference, of course, to Alexei Andreevich Stakhanov, who was the ideal shock worker of the Soviet Union in 1936. Anyway, so obviously Sengai is getting really into this idea of Mongolian equivalence of Stakhanov, and actually it just goes on and on and on in the same vein, and finishes: when those who become visible to the sharp eye of Choibalsan's party walk the uphill path of socialism, no greater strength to lead exists than if the working class and you workers, guided by the party, bring glory to the laborers. Yeah, so you already have an idea of what this is about, and you know this is kind of like a slightly extreme version of many of these poems. I mean, even Ganbat the Student, with his slightly homoerotic ending of Ganbat's visionary, dream-like interaction with Choibalsan. You know, it's really unusual, and if you compare this with what was being written even 5 years before the Great Repression, it's really different. And this is actually one of the things that I find most interesting: the development, the sudden development in discourse and language and theme of this literature. So you get people like Sengai, who has already changed from some of his pieces, very kind of juvenilia in his late teens and the late 30s, to this, which is kind of reminiscent of Soviet period, Soviet pieces at the time. Okay. And the final one, I apologize for the quality of this photograph. This seems to be the only photograph of Tantric Joe available. He is really interesting. He wrote Dampil the Messenger with this date of the death of Sukhbata, and this is like the first and the fourth of 4 sections about Dampil's crazy ride, somewhat like Paul Revere, to give Choibalsan the information that Sukhbata had died. And there's a lot of weeping and a lot of misery, and he can't see where he's going, but he just follows his heart and gets to Choibalsan. And Choibalsan says something very interesting. So his grief. So when he hands over the telegram, he says the grief grew more profound, and the other, that's Choibalsan, received the unhappy news, stood thinking a moment with frowning brows, and said, "Our son is still eternal." So even notwithstanding the death of Sukhbata, our son is still eternal. All right, and he's really interesting. There's an aside to this. He died at the age of 20 in 1941, and there's a passage in one of Bast's memoirs, and Bast being still alive at the age of 97, the one member of this cohort that is still alive, he and Sengai, and Udval were the only three people who took Tantric Joe's body back to, I forget where he's from, maybe Khenti, I think, and buried him. Just these 3 writers taking the other writer back. It's kind of a moving image, and if you look at this is the face of quite an amazing young man. And this poem and the other one, I've forgotten what the Mongolian name, but it's about Sukhbata as the leader of the revolution. He's very taken by Sukhbata, very taken, and because of his birth being 2 years before Sukhbata died, he is not taken by Sukhbata, right? He's taken by the image of Sukhbata, and this is very interesting in terms of this entire book, which is kind of like an idealist view of, in 18 pieces, an idealist view of Mongolia moving into the 1940s following the Great Repression. Okay, so as a kind of summary, this is what this book really does, the kind of key ideas. So it represented the MPRP's explicit move towards the Soviet Union as expressed in the 1940 Constitution. Oh, by the way, Bust wrote one of Bust's poems here is called Choibelson's Constitution, and it's a paean to Choibelson's Constitution. It's not a very good piece. It's not one of his best, but it's interesting about the Constitution. So it's also the response of young writers to the conference, the drive to increase livestock numbers, the party's relationship between Mongolia and the Soviet Union, unionizing and promoting the socialist view of labor, and the development of industry, all really important in the 1940s, particularly after the war started. I don't believe this is published after the war, after the 21st of June, because there's nothing about the war, absolutely nothing. So I imagine it's before the war. The book also explicitly encouraged writers to take an active part in Mongolia's development as a socialist state, and also promoted the ideals of labor and party loyalty, which would be developed following the Soviet model into revolutionary realism, Hoverskalt realism, before the first Writers' Congress in 1948, and was introduced at that Writers' Congress by, oh, I've forgotten his name now, but it's not a writer. I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. But it was launched at the Writers' Conference in 1948 as an official policy. Okay. Okay, so this comes from Sengai's the very first poem in this book by Sengai, the first Bolshevik raise in our party, Manenam Aktagar Bolshevik Doya, I think is the title. Rise, slaves, rise, arts, straighten up your calloused knees, take out your swords and drive them through, sharpen your harsh resolve. And that's the second verse. So there's a lot there. I think there are like maybe 10 verses. So, but it doesn't stop. This is the idea all the way through. So you get the idea. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So do we have any questions? Yes.
Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. I think that I really strongly agree with your idea that about how this the period from 1938 to 1941 was this tremendous break that really made a very different, a radical change in all aspects. So I think you've shown that very nicely in your paper. I wanted to ask about the formal properties of the poems. I mean, I know Sengai did some things with, normally Mongol is some head rhyme. I know Sengai tried aspects of end rhyme. In this anthology, do you see any formal experimentation with more Russian-like verse characteristics, or is it still formally more like Mongolian poetry with head rhyme and so on?
Yeah, it's quite similar. I mean, there's a lot of Sultvolgoi. The Mayakovsky broken lines started with Tantric Joe in the slightly later. His poem Ulaanbaatar, you probably know Ulaanbaatar, right? Was the first free verse, and Sengai's not using anything very exciting here. It's basically the same kind of regular structure. Yeah. Yes.
I didn't quite understand how did you see those poems? Are you going to translate those poems?
No, eventually the whole thing I want to translate.
So how did you make selection of those poems?
Oh, no. So it's gone away now. My list is, those are the poems. There are 18 pieces, right? And the color coding was my rather inept attempt to associate poems with policy, right? You know, like the Sengai poem I showed, there is a whole bunch of party there and labor and maybe not the relationship between Choivelson and what's his name, Stalin, but there's obviously some, again, maybe homoerotic or some sort of excitable Choivelson worship there. Okay, so a lot of these poems have many different aspects, right? But the color coding is the basic political focus. Yeah.
What type of, I'm trying to understand, I know there was parties from party to write poems and to fit public in general on certain topics, and I understand that, but I never understood, even growing up in socialism, how that party ordered, did they ask specific writers to write on certain topics, or how did that part happen?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I know that I don't know what the exact stimulus for this was, but I know that 12 years earlier, 10 years earlier maybe, Mini Nutuk's Natuk Dodge's Mini Nutuk came out of a writers' union competition, which asked for poets to write about revolutionary aspects of the Mongolian countryside, right? So I think probably the idea was, I mean, Chris may know more about this. What do you think? The idea was maybe that all the writers could just write whatever they came up with, but the best ones, the ones that the party thought were most appropriate, or with the best writing, or with the most sort of political approach, would be the ones that were privileged. Yeah?
That's what I would guess, but you know, really, I don't know if that basic research that was done. And what we really think to look in the archives of the writers and see if they, if anybody, you know, how the sausage was made.
Yeah.
How do you direct? Or is it just you put out a call for poems? You have a call for papers, a call for poems. Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, so this competition in 1934, actually was in Unen. It was, and so it just said, you know, I'm quoting from another source, not from Unen, but basically it was, you know, writers write about the countryside and the socialist attitude of the countryside, atmosphere of the countryside, and so they had a whole bunch of writers, including Natuk Dodge's Mini Nutuk, and they just chose a few, and then yeah, I mean, about the same time they had a drama competition about socialist. What is it? Maybe so. Yeah, socialist. Something to express the time since the revolution, and then all the names are going away from me now. But there are a whole, I mean, like people like Namdak and Boyanemik and Yaram Suran, I think, they all sent in plays. So I think on the whole they were general calls. I think maybe later, in a much later period that I don't know so much about, maybe individual people were asked to take a theme or a translation and work with that. But at this stage, I think it was pretty inchoate right now. Yeah.
My question concerns, I was struck by the praise of Stalin in his poems. Did anything happen to the popularity of these poets and their poems after the Khrushchev secret speech in 1956 and the kind of de-Stalinization? Did these people's popularity suffer after after that?
Sengai was dead. No. Actually, that's not true. Sengai died in 1959. That's a really interesting question. But interestingly, at the time of Khrushchev's speech, Sengai was a student and continued to be a student for another year in the Gorky Academy in Russia, in Soviet Union, in Moscow. So I don't think he suffered a lot. But yeah, so this Odanik and also Hlamsoren's what's it called? Manesuruk, I think it's called, Our Herds. These are not in the any collected works. So some of these writers did not, I mean, they were all really, most of them were really young. The oldest was Sodnum, who was born in 1908. So he was 33. So they were all pretty well all in their 20s. I mean, Bast and Udval and Tantric Joe were all 20 years old. So, and they had much longer careers. So I think the ones that we know about now were the smart ones who changed their trajectories according to the party, right? Tantric Joe died in 1941, so he is left as this kind of mysterious cloud-like, slightly vague cloud-like presence in this faded photograph. But other people, I mean, Udval became very, very powerful, and she married a very, very unpleasant man called who was Dodge, was it Mangas Dodge? Yeah. It depends who you ask. I'm sure Udval didn't think he was unpleasant. But yeah, so some of them were, some of them became very popular, and some of them just sort of did other things, you know.
Эдгээр бид нарын үед бол сүүлийн бас гайхалтай зүйлүүд байдаг шүү дээ. Одоо монголчууд үнээр одоо дэвшилтэй гарчсан. Тэгээд энэний нөлөө нь Оросын тэр урлагийн нөлөө байсан юм уу? Эсвэл тэр хүмүүс тэрнээс өмнөх үеийн монголчуудын одоо анхан тохиол тэрний нөлөөгөөр эдгээр гайхалтайгаа шүлжиж юм. Яг нь цэцлэг хоёрын бид нар бол бас германд суралцж байсан тийм. Бидний багш нар хэн байсан? Юу тэднэрт тийм их одоо дэвшилтэй гарахаар гайхалтай нөлөө үзүүлсэн.
Okay. His question was a boy named Maxo were graduated in Germany. The first question was their poems are impacted by the Russian culture in their governments, or was it something else that impacted or influenced their researchers in there? And the second question was who their teachers were.
What their futures were?
The teachers.
Oh, their teachers. Buyanemik was not in Germany. Tantric Joe went to Germany. Tantric Joe and Sodnum and Nauenyunden, they all went to Germany. And so Tantric Joe, I don't think that either of them had teachers, like writing teachers or writing mentors. That's actually a really interesting question. I don't know. I don't know. What was the other point? I've forgotten.
He's asking about lots of from ancient Mongolian poems, ancient Mongolian poem writing, on their writing.
Oh yes. I think there is, particularly Buyanemik. I'm not so much an expert in pre-modern literature, but I think there's imagery and style is very, very much in keeping with much older much older literatures. Maybe Chris or Sarul could answer that better.
Гүнгийн бараан байсан учраас дандаа өвөр Монголын айлгуудтай учраас тэгээд бас өвөр Монголын оскочтой хамт ажиллаж байсан. Тэгэхээр шүүлийн талаар ямар моделтэй ямар дагуултай байсан гэж
хиний зөвхөн политикчдэр зохиол өгөх нь өмнөх Монголын ардын амын зохиол дэжтэр өмнөх сонгодог ам нь сонгодог зохиолын зөвхөн амар тодорхой тийм нөгөө хэний надад нисэм үлгэх газар гэдэг чинь одоо бид нацаг дорж явах гэж боддог бол аль хэдийн чинь өмнө байж тэр тодорхой болчихсон одоо тийм тэрнээс авч зүйтэй байж байгаа. Харин нь хэн өөрөө нацаг дорж мэдээж хэрэгтэр инженерийн нэг маш тодорхой. Инженерийн нөлөө нацаг дорж зүйтэй бүр яг тодорхой. Тэр өнөөдөр яг инженерийн нөлөө байгаа. Гэхдээ бас барууны нөлөө, Германы нөлөө бас тодорхой байгааг нь энэ бүхлэдээр сайнны өмнөх энэ яг Германы тэр шинжлэх ухааны соёл бодлого нацаг дорж зохиол яаж нөлөөлсөн тодорхой үзлээ. Энэ дотор байж байгаа сайнны өдөр нь байна.
Өмнө жилд сүүлдээ байна.
Okay. Please.
Саяны дурдсан шүлгүүдийн жишээлбэл өнөөдрийн өндөрлөгөөс ингээд харахад болоод энэ хязгаарч тийм социализм өнтер туулаагүй энэ Америк хүмүүсийн хувьд үзэхэд тийм маш нээдтэй юм шиг боловч тэр чинь тухайн үедээ тэр хүмүүсийг зоригжуул одоо тийм Ленин сайхан итгэх тэр итгэл бол бас дууд болж ирсэн мэдгүй. Хоёрдугаарт тэгэхээр тийм хоёрдугаарт бас бид нар чинь яг саяны шүлгүүд жишээлбэл хүмүүсийнх нь өөрөлдөө тэр хуулийн тэр шүлгүүд нь бол ихэнх манай зохиолчдын яг гол бүтээлүүд биш байдаг. Тэд нар бол яг тэрүүгээрээ үлдээгүй. Зүгээр өөр сайхан юмараа үлдсэн. Тийм тал байна. Та яг өөрөө Америк, Англи хүний хувьд одоо таны үүднээс үзэхэд энэ шүлгүүд тийм одоо очиргүй Сталиний багтна гэдэг бол орны хүмүүсийн хувьд бол байж болохгүй шахуу юм шүү дээ. Тийм ээ. Тэгээд тань юу гэж бодогддог вэ? Саяны миний хэлстэй санаа нь их үү?
Two questions. First question is that when we see here from the Western view, the people who were never in such system, maybe it sounds funny, it's very funny. So, as you are one of the Westerners, how you see those? Is it like from funny side of you, or just you understand it differently? The second question is, actually, those are just like this first time. There's a kind of party what Portugal asked. This kind of for the that we talked about is laws and kind of literature. But so actually, among the Mongolian people, they for Natsudars or any others, the real different, more dramatic, more this kind of different literature were left, like remained as their heritage. So it's not them, but another thing. So what do you think?
Yes, well, I think that well, what you find, I mean, if you think about Sengai, right? Sengai started out as this. In some accounts, he is implicated in the death of Boyanomik on one level. But in the next sort of almost 20 years of his life until he died, Bast said that Sengai had two sides, right? On the one side, he was the sort of arch revolutionary, Sovietized revolutionary, but on the other side, he was a very gentle and very good and kind man. And his his writing is very interesting because it's it's very childlike and very beautiful and very elegant. But on the other hand, it's like this. So what do we make of someone like that? And for your first, so if you look at this, if you look at Sengai's work through your first question, this seems very powerful and very determined and very honest. But it sounds to me as, you know, it's not interesting poetry to read for fun. It's fascinating in terms of the context. It's fascinating in terms of Mongolia. But it's not like beautiful poetry. It's not elegant poetry. It's kind of crass, right? It's like Demian Bedney, a little bit better than Demian Bedney. But if you think about these writers, they're starting their careers and they're trying to get published. And the way to get published at this time was to write things like this. I remember, this is from several decades later, but Mindoyo told me that when he produced his first book, he took it to Yao Holan, and Yao Holan said, "You need something about Lenin." So he wrote a poem about Lenin, and it was published. So this was like in 1980, but even at this stage, so maybe not even at this stage, specifically at this stage, if you wanted to get published, if you wanted to develop as a writer, clearly you needed to write stuff like this. Whether this was in their heart or not, we can't know. 3 or 4 years later, at the end of the war, on the day that the war stopped, Sengai wrote 2 really beautiful, very short poems. And one of them is very famous. It's the one, someone will remember it. It's the one that goes something like, little children come outside in the rain or go inside, something like that. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's one apparently that's sung a lot when it's raining in Mongolia. Yeah, you know the one? Yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. 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 But he wrote that on the day that the war was declared over. And that's an extraordinary thing where, you know, you could talk about the victory of the Soviets and the friendship, the victory of the friendship between the Mongolia and the Soviets, the wonderful sacrifice of the soldiers. No, but he says, "Come, Soviet children, come and play with us." Yeah? That is an amazing development for this young man in but 4 years from this sort of nonsense about Udanik and Lusung, right? To this beautiful, short, very heartfelt piece of writing. It's an extraordinary development. So I think we have to remember things like this when we think about what they're writing in this book, because Hlamsuren developed into a really interesting writer. Udval, despite her marriage, also developed into a very interesting writer of stories.
Right.
And you know, and other people also on this list. Bast, for instance, beautiful kind of lyrical poems. And yes, and Sengai too, and Sendochir too. People like that were writing really amazing stuff very soon after this, in the 50s and maybe the 60s too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor Wickhamsmith.